Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today I will be assisted by Mark Lee, producer of Pod TV. Thank you, Mark. Welcome to the show.
Hey, no problem at all. I see a lot of things are going on there in the war in Russia and Ukraine. I actually had mentioned on our show yesterday as we were closing some interesting news that I think you'll find interesting. Maybe here on Pod TV, the folks in Russia are paying attention to you because I actually looked up some of the statistics and where people were watching from. And I saw that there was a region in Russia that had at least a couple of listeners that were watching. And I don't know enough about Russia to know where Kostovo is, but apparently we've got some folks that are paying attention to us in Kostovo, Russia, and all along those lines. I think it's on one of the major rivers, but you would know better than I would. But I did see that that was something that I was looking up, is how the shows were doing. And I saw that we had some folks watching from Ukraine, Germany, of course, tons watching from the United States. And I also saw that apparently some people in Russia are paying attention to us and the various things that you are talking about. So I don't know where
Mark,
that part of Russia is.
thank you. That's very interesting information because there are really a lot of Russian and Ukrainian, by the way, talk shows. I'm watching actually quite a few of them. And it seems to me that there is no void of Russian, Ukrainian sources of information and different internet resources. And I think what we are doing here on Pod TV is very remarkable because we are providing independent, I would say partially independent, because what kind of independence there could be when you have a country aggressor liable for killings of hundreds of thousands of people? How you can be impartially independent and impartially trying to be, what are you going to justify Russian aggression in order to be neutral? I refuse to do that, never will. So we provide in English, I would say, at least independent information, that's for sure. Our information independent. We are not paid by any sources, whether it's pro-Russian or pro-Ukrainian or pro-American or anti-American. We are not. We provide our independent view on this war. Mark, you agree with that?
No, I definitely agree with you on that. Definitely an independent view. And like you said, oftentimes people are having different thoughts and different opinions, but definitely I think everybody on the network agrees that Russia is the aggressor and is doing a unjust war and should get out of that country as fast as possible. I think that pretty much everybody here on the network would agree with that and agree with your attitude around that and everything. One thing, Sasha, that I am aware of is, even though I am not Catholic by nature and everything, I did go to a Jesuit university, and I know that every once in a while religious figures like to put their hands in things as well. So apparently Pope Francis is doing that as well. He's really recently gone to Buddhist Mongolia, and apparently he was praising a Russian composer and definitely saying some other things around Russia and China involvement. So I was just wondering, what is your thoughts when the Vatican decides that it wants to put its opinion about what is going on in the war? And apparently he is coming out maybe in some attitudes that aren't as pro-Ukrainian as they probably should be. But I'm just wondering if you've been following what the Pope's been saying, and if it surprised you that the Pope came out praising these Russian individuals. Like I said, I have to find out who the Russian composer was, but I know he praised them, and he was also talking about the imperial nature of Russian imperialism. And I think he was talking about more like the Tsar Russia versus the Putin Russia, but he was praising some of that attitude and all along those lines. But are you surprised that a religious leader would be taking that tact?
Yeah, I'm surprised. I'm upset. And he's really diminishing role of Catholic Church in a world, because Catholic Church, see, in practical terms, Catholic Church, as most other religions, it's somewhat think of the past. And the past was, at some point, was violent, and on some point of view, it was magnificent. Because if you will take a cultural meaning of Catholic Church, for example, with all the Vatican museums, the music of Bach, although Bach was Protestant, doesn't matter. Um, it's a great thing. This is, in my opinion, the only positive thing of Christianity as a whole is exactly the works of art it inspired. That's a great meaning, and I don't think that the Pope Francis at his age should really meddle into politics. And surprisingly, neither Russia, not most of the Ukrainian territory is Catholic. So why he is all of a sudden is trying to voice his opinion on war between two non-Catholic countries? That's very upsetting, and the only excuse is his age, I guess, and his background, social background, which is coming from origin. I don't want to go into it, and I don't want to really criticize him. It's unfair. I voiced my opinion what it is.
No, definitely. One thing that I saw in the news was that Zelensky, the leader of Ukraine, has boasted of the new long-range weapons that are there in the country days after the strikes inside Russia. So apparently, a Ukrainian-made weapon hit a target 700 kilometers away, and it looks like there are some serious long-range weapons that are being developed. So are we going to see more strikes at the heart of Russia, and will that change the mind of the Russian people? And I know that there are some folks that have said that and even you folks, you and Jonathan have talked about a armistice and all in that space. So are we going to actually be having some negotiations, or are we going to continue this war for a number of months and it will eventually end in a Ukrainian victory, maybe even without an armistice, or maybe even without maybe it'll end in a ceasefire? But I just wanted your take about the impact of these long-range missiles that are now able to strike so far away.
You see, Mark, there are several different levels of understanding what Ukrainians are doing with these long-range missiles. Let's go from simple things to more complicated. The simple thing is, yes, Ukraine has its own production missiles capable of hitting targets of at least 700 kilometers, has already been proven. Now, Zelensky also mentioned that it could be increased to 1,000 kilometers range and even 1,500 or so on. So the targets well beyond Moscow can be reached by Ukrainian-produced missiles. Now, why I'm saying that a Ukrainian-produced missile is such an important thing? Because the West, especially the United States, is scared of escalation, so-called, and that's why they are of the opinion that they are trying to ratchet the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine very slowly. For example, with the certain weapons, they talk about it for several months. Then all of a sudden, other country, whether it's England or Germany or somebody else, supplying this or similar type of weapons. And then US almost saying, well, but we have no choice, these missiles are already supplied. So we don't want to lose our market share, so we're going to also supply this or so on. Same thing is going, it was going with tanks. For a long time, it was debate whether supply tanks or not. Now, the position of US is that it's not escalation what Biden is scared of. No, he says the word escalation, he means something else entirely. He is scared of thermonuclear war. That's what he's scared of. This is why he's paralyzed to supply weapons to Ukraine when it's needed the most. This is why Ukrainians are losing so many their brave soldiers because of the Biden doctrine, of because he's scared to death of thermonuclear war, so he's refusing to supply in timely matter the weapons to Ukraine. So now we are talking about why when Soviet Union was disappeared in 1991, U.S. doctrine, so it was replaced by 15 republics, including Ukraine and Georgia, Baltic republics, many others, all Uzbekistan and others. Okay. So the doctrine of United States was that, okay, so there are 15 republics, but in reality, it's Russia, the big, powerful Russia, is republic number one and only number one. All the other republics, they're like satellites, they're former Soviet Union republics, and probably sometime in the future they will join Russia and become back to Soviet Union or new Soviet Union or so on. So therefore, United States treated Russia as a world power, and all the other republics are, okay, they're just there, maybe temporarily. So this is why came decision, the Budapest Memorandum, that Ukraine ceded all its nuclear arsenal, which was number 3 in the world at the time, to Russia. So essentially, it's US and the West and NATO cleared a path for Russia became a dominant power over all other republics, including Ukraine. So when Ukraine wanted to fight for its independence, first in 2004, when it was election of Yushchenko, and instead Russia and Putin had their own favorite, Yanukovych, former criminal, and they lost. So Putin was very, very upset about this. So he wanted to take revenge. And it all started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the making these phony republics in Donetsk and Lugansk. What US did about that? Nothing. It was times of Obama being president. They did nothing. So they allowed Russia through pure aggression, not provoked aggression, but just go in, annex some territories, create their own government in some other territories. And it all because West's essentially lack of response, for a better way to say it. Putin became emboldened and started this horrible war in 2022, in February 24th. This is all led. So now, because the understanding that the Russia is supreme power in that region and all others, including Ukraine, they're like former parts of great Soviet Union, and who knows, maybe in the future they will become parts again. Oh, hi, Jonathan.
Hello.
Yeah, I
here,
will finish.
Sorry, I'm late.
monologue
Finally got the link. That's okay.
Oh,
no problem. I'm going to drop off, let y'all have the conversation, but I will throw out this ball of fire, as they like to say. It's one of those grenades that definitely that I know that Jonathan loves and all in that space. But I know earlier we were talking, Jonathan, on the World Edition, the one you call the food fight, about AI. And one thing that I was seeing was that Russian hackers have infiltrated Ukraine battlefield devices. So the question that I've got to ask both of you as I get ready to walk out the door and all in that space is, are you concerned about hackers being able to control some of those powerful military weapons that Ukraine is in control of, and all along those lines? Because I did see that that was something that was going on. And the other thing that I was going to talk to Sasha about is Erdogan meeting with Putin. And I guess that is to discuss the Ukrainian grain deal and all along those lines. But those are the two grenades that I'll throw at you, and y'all can answer those two grenades as I am walking out the door, but definitely the first one because I know
or
you're a
we might
security
just toss
person.
them back to you, whichever.
No problem.
But in any case, Sasha, I was listening, and also one thing I might interject is that it's interesting to note that in the news that Ukraine is responding to the criticisms that have been leveled at them at their plan at the slow pace of their counteroffensive, and that essentially one of Ukraine's leaders essentially told Western experts to just shut up.
And I heard that.
Yeah, to just shut up because they do not understand the context of why Ukraine is doing what it's doing. And one of them exhorted them, says, well, those Western experts should come over to Ukraine and see if they can liberate 1 square centimeter of Ukrainian territory by themselves.
Excellent.
And
they,
it was an excellent
their
response.
own generals.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that the Western expert thing is people hate to be made to look stupid or in error. And on several occasions, the Western so-called experts, the vast majority, have been made to look stupid or in error. They were in error about Ukraine's ability to resist Russia. Then they were in error about, they were in error on several counts. And so what's interesting now is that they are slowly coming around to say that the Ukrainians are doing much better, given what they have, the resources that they have, much better than expected, and that the Ukrainian counteroffensive does have its own logic, and it has its own internal dynamic. They are the analogy that I used on previous versions of this program is that the Ukrainian army can be likened to a skilled professional boxer. They have been firing jabs at a very aggressive opponent, keeping that opponent off balance. And the key is to keep the Russians off balance, inflict superior casualties, wear them down, and then the Ukrainians, we will note, they still have those uncommitted reserves of formations that they have. Those reserves, in my opinion, are being held in reserve for the proper moment when the Ukrainians manage to sever the link between Russia and Crimea. That isolates the Russian occupation forces in Crimea from reinforcement or resupply. And at that moment, they will be the moment for the Ukrainians to commit their uncommitted armored reserves for an offensive into Crimea to compel the surrender of Russian occupation forces there. Crimea falls back into Ukrainian hands, and you'll have a major operational defeat for the Russian army and for Russia in general. This will then generate its own momentum, political momentum, to compel Russia to accept a ceasefire or an armistice. Because once Crimea falls back under Ukrainian control, then the Ukrainians will be able to build on that momentum and switch their forces, their armored reserves, to liberating the rest of Ukraine and just methodically sweeping the Russians out of Ukrainian territory. But
hold on. If that scenario is real, and I believe it is, and maybe we will all see it this September.
Yeah, it could come.
Then what is the incentive for Ukraine to have any talks with the enemy who lost his army, lost his power, and it's on the way down? What's incentives for Ukraine?
There is no incentive for Ukraine to, at this point, especially if it inflicts a major operational defeat on Russian forces, there's absolutely no incentive for Ukraine to engage in any kind of talks other than
surrender,
withdrawal, armistice, whatever they want to call it, for the Russians to withdraw their forces from the remainder of those areas in Ukraine that they previously occupied, and just to say, okay, and the only cover, if you want to say it, that Russia will have is, well, they can posture and say, well, we taught Ukraine a lesson, and we'll withdraw peacefully back, having taught Ukraine a military lesson. Yeah, the lesson you taught Ukraine is you guys are incompetent. But and really are not nearly as powerful as you pretend to be. But
the Ukrainians turned the table against the teacher.
Yes, they did. Well, yes, they did. And the thing is also Ukrainians have also successfully turned the tables on most of the so-called Western experts who have been critical of Ukraine and its style of warfare, when in reality, the Ukrainians have been doing remarkably well with what they have been given, and been unexpectedly successful. The Western military experts, for the most part, did not predict any of this. They did not anticipate it. If President Biden has been reluctant to rush in as much aid as possible as fast as the Ukrainians would want, is because, for one thing, he did not anticipate this at all, and neither did his advisors, I will wager. So they are trying to grope their way through what to them is a very delicate and chaotic situation, and try to make it come out as least disastrous as possible, given all the other problems that people are experiencing. And are they afraid of escalation? Well, if they are, they can also, when Russia threatens with their nuclear arsenal, our logical response at this point can be, by the way, we have demonstrated that we have very good theater ballistic missile defenses, and you have no idea how good our national ballistic missile defenses are. And oh, by the way, you do know this, that the combined nuclear arsenals of NATO, the NATO nations, and the United States are larger than those of Russia. So you can threaten all you like, we can threaten you back.
Absolutely. And I believe, again, I'm not expert in this field, that overall NATO and United States strategic defense systems are way better than Russians, and Russians demonstrate that they have no air defense against Ukrainian drones and now missiles, which can reach 700 kilometers.
But you're correct. And the even more interesting thing is that the great unknown in this equation is the actual strength and effectiveness of the United States ballistic missile defenses for its own territory. I mean, we have certain declared numbers of ABM launchers, but they have no idea how really effective or how fast we could ramp up our ballistic missile defenses to perform to really increase the uncertainty in the minds of Russian planners. Remember, I pointed out many years ago when the U.S. first declared its Strategic Defense Initiative in the book Inside the KGB by Oleg Gordievsky and Christopher Andrew. They described that KGB report that was sent to Gorbachev in April 1985. KGB was assessing the U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative. And they assessed at that time that according to Gordievsky, that the U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative would eventually be able to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike. And there was no way that the Soviet Union could keep up with this capability. That was what drove Gorbachev to do everything he could to persuade President Reagan, to give up the SDI program, which Reagan wisely refused to do. Go ahead.
But I'm afraid that Russians learned quite a lot from Ronald Reagan, because basically it was obviously the myth that they did not have anything resembling Star Wars capabilities. It was basically a plan to do something in the future. Okay, so now Russians are very skillfully terrorizing United States and the West and NATO with their idea that they could use nuclear devices. Now, a few months ago, we were talking about tactical nuclear weapons. They're not talking now about tactical nuclear weapons. They're getting even more ambiguous about what they're prepared to do. And doesn't matter whether it's said by an idiot Medvedev or some other people in Russian government, but because it's been said by Medvedev, who has certain positions, he's a head of Party United Russia and many other posts, and nobody, Putin or anybody else, said, hold on, that's a mistake, you shouldn't have said that. Nobody did that. So everything what's coming from his mouth is taken by the West as, probably that's the position of Russian government, and they are being terrified. And thank God Ukraine now has its own missiles hitting 700 kilometers or more. So the escalation is going to happen, whether Biden wants it or not, whether he's capable to do anything about it or not. And now the word escalation should be taken out of vocabulary about this word once whatsoever. What do you think, Jonathan?
Well, the interesting thing is that this situation, in a way, reminds me of what happened when Khrushchev first acquired the Soviet Union first developed demonstrated an ICBM capability in 1957.
Yep.
And soon thereafter, you notice that Khrushchev was engaging in a campaign of strategic bluffing. He was talking about how the Soviet Union was going to be turning out ICBMs like sausages, and trying to give the impression that the Soviet Union had many more ICBMs than was actually the case.
It's all bluff.
It was a total bluff. And the U.S. was able to call that bluff because of the U-2 spy plane overflights. And they were able to reveal that results showed that the Soviet Union, counter to the claims of their having, dozens or hundreds of ICBMs, they had 6. They had 6. They were all above ground. They were not in silos. And according to the assessments of the CIA, it would have taken about a day to prepare them to launch. In effect, the United States, in a preemptive strike, could have taken out those 6 Soviet ICBMs with its bomber force, not even having to launch missiles. They could have taken them out with a bomber force. So that was the reality, and that was what further enabled the United States to, under Kennedy, to stand up to the Soviet Union and call their bluff in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because at that time, the United States had about 130 ICBMs capable of striking the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had an estimated 35, about a 4-to-1 ratio. And that's not including all of the essentially thousands of bombs, which could have been delivered by B-52 and B-58s. And that point was arguably the last realistic time that the United States could have engaged in full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union and win that war, albeit at heavy cost. The Soviet Union would have been able to strike, but the Soviet Union would effectively have been destroyed by a massive United States nuclear counterstrike.
And the last year was 1957. Is that correct?
No, that was the year that the Soviet Union acquired a capability, demonstrated they could fire an ICBM.
But they had only 6.
Yeah, by 1960, they were revealed to have only 6. By the time, so again, it was, the incoming Kennedy administration, once they had the information and it began their buildup, that they knew that the Soviets' nuclear threat was not entirely an empty threat, but the United States had overwhelming nuclear superiority at that point. So right now, if we take it to the current context, the reason I've been advocating several times on this program that the United States and NATO should begin planning for creating a global ballistic missile defense system.
Maybe they do.
And if they do, and that would involve an upgrading. In order to make it fully effective, it would involve an upgrading of the U.S. Space Force to include a space fleet armed with lasers in Earth orbit, capable of taking out ballistic missiles in their boost phase. That is the key. Right now, Patriot cannot take out a nuclear missile or a tactical missile in its boost phase when it's on its way up. And something that is in Earth orbit, preferably a manned spacecraft, the Space Force, armed with lasers, would be capable of taking out nuclear missiles in their boost phase. And if you have a constellation of such spacecraft capable of doing so, you have the makings of an interlocking shield ballistic missile defense system, which is capable of neutralizing the Russian nuclear arsenal. The one thing that Russians say make them a great power at all.
But do you think it's possible this spacecraft, especially equipped spacecraft, could be targets for Russian or Chinese possible?
targets for their counter space weapons. Russian and Chinese counter space weapons are designed to take out satellites, not manned spacecraft. Yeah, matter of fact, there's a significant difference between, you see, if they were to target Russia, if Russia and China were either target U.S. satellites, that's rather ambiguous. It's not quite clearly an act of war because, as one humorist once pointed out, satellites don't have mothers. But if you target a U.S. Space Force Starship, bought from Elon Musk and modified for the U.S. Space Force, and it's in Earth orbit and it's armed with a laser weapon, and if a Russian or Chinese satellite or anti-satellite weapon tries to target that starship, one thing, the starship with its lasers and its defensive equipment would be able to destroy the satellite, and number two, that's an act of war. That's a clear and unambiguous act of war if you're targeting a manned U.S. Space Force starship in Earth orbit. So this is what the argument why, in order to increase stability and prevent war, you have to be able to have a crewed Space Force starship system in space, which will essentially be able to neutralize the nuclear arsenals of any rogue nation or aggressor nation, such as Russia or even China or North Korea for that matter. So this is how the U.S. and NATO could and should join together in order to neutralize the nuclear arsenals, which are the greatest threat to peace. Because the Russians, as you know, when they translate their Russian nuclear forces, when they call them deterrence forces, they translate it as ustrashenia, intimidation forces. And that's a very qualitatively different attitude than our attitude of deterrence, because we use deterrence in it has a different meaning for us.
Absolutely. Agree with you. Jonathan, don't want to forget that on the last program, we promised that we will talk a little bit about U.S. election process.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm a Russia expert, not a U.S. I do not like touching U.S. elections, not with a proverbial 10-foot pole, because it is so chaotic. And right now, what I can tell you is that the implications of the U.S. elections for the Russian-Ukrainian war. Absolutely. And the likely attitudes of both protagonists, Russia and Ukraine, towards the U.S. elections. What do the Ukrainians want from the U.S. elections? The outcome that they want is an outcome from whoever wins, that the U.S. political leadership will continue to support Ukraine. Well, they can't really be sure of that with either party. So its uncertainty is either party. So it's a great unknown to the Ukrainians. It doesn't really matter in a larger sense, because they've got a time limit. On the Russian side, they are banking on. They are thinking, in all likelihood, that, well, if Donald Trump gets elected, he said he could end the war in a day, which the implication of that is he would give Russia everything he wants and compel a peace, which may or may not be the case. He could change his mind. Events could convince him that between now and the next election that it's really in the West's interest, and his NATO allies may persuade him it's not in our best interest to throw Ukraine to the wolves or to Russian occupation and control. So that could change between now and then. What is really when you look at all of the factors that are involved here, the one thing that really stands out is that Ukraine still controls its own destiny. They can still compel, if not a permanent peace, at least an armistice or a ceasefire. And the only path to doing that is inflicting a major operational defeat on the Russian army. And the key to that is cutting the link between Russia and Crimea.
Absolutely.
Once that happens, then the rest falls into place. And many in the Western experts, even though they aren't necessarily as brave about coming out and saying it, they are increasingly recognizing, or being compelled to recognize, that Ukraine has its own logic, its own plan, and they are following it assiduously. And I'm tempted to agree with that fellow in Ukraine who says is telling Western experts to just shut up because because they're being opportunistic. The Western experts, they didn't want to look bad. They didn't want to look ill-informed or foolish, and so they've been critical of the Ukrainian counteroffensive simply because it hasn't been done in the way they would expect it to be done. Well, I'm sorry. This world is not Burger King. You don't get it your way. So,
Jonathan, thank you very much for sharing your opinion about many subjects, including even U.S. election, as it applies.
yes, I mean, the U.S. election right now, it is so chaotic and so volatile that I would be hesitant in any forum to try and assess what could happen or what should happen. And it's just you just don't want to go there. And I am not an expert on the U.S. political process. I have my own opinions, but I choose not to share them simply because it would do no good, and it would just create a further mess.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much for today's program, and have a great weekend. And we'll see you on Tuesday, same place, same time.
Oh, thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Hey.